They told Carrie Underwood and Karoline Leavitt to take off their American flag pins. What happened next left the entire room speechless. The lights inside the Grand Ole Opry House in Nashville glowed with a soft, golden hue, casting a warm reflection over the packed auditorium. It wasn't just another night at the legendary venue. The Honor and Sacrifice Charity Gala had brought together some of the biggest names in entertainment, politics, and business to support a cause that transcended fame, helping veterans and their families. At a round table near the stage, Carrie Underwood adjusted the delicate fabric of her navy blue gown, her fingers brushing over the small American flag pin fastened to her dress. It wasn't just an accessory. It was a quiet tribute to her family's military roots. Her grandfather had served in World War II, and she had spent years performing for troops overseas. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt scanned the room, noting the familiar faces from news networks and political circles. She wasn't here for debates or interviews. She was here to honor the people who had risked their lives for the country. Like Carrie, she also wore a tiny flag pin, pinned neatly on the lapel of her blazer. The event was in full swing. Conversations blended with the soft strum of an acoustic guitar from the stage, where a retired Marine was performing a song he had written during deployment. Servers in black vests maneuvered through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and bite-sized appetizers. Laughter and murmured conversations filled the air, but there was an underlying reverence in the room. Everyone knew why they were here. At the center of the venue, a massive screen displayed live footage of soldiers overseas watching the event. Some waved at the camera, others simply smiled. A few had missing limbs. A couple wore prosthetics. But every single one of them looked proud. The night's biggest highlight was yet to come. Carrie and Karoline had been invited to present an award, a lifetime service recognition for a 92-year-old Korean War veteran, Colonel Robert Henshaw. He had served 3 decades in the military, losing friends, sacrificing personal time, and dedicating his life to others. This moment was supposed to be about him, but something unexpected was about to unfold. As Carrie leaned toward Karoline to exchange a few words, a woman dressed in an elegant black dress and an event coordinator badge approached their table. Her smile was polite, but there was a stiffness to it, like she was about to say something she knew wouldn't sit well. She lowered her voice and leaned in. "Ladies, I need a quick word before you go on stage." Carrie and Karoline exchanged a glance before rising from their seats. The coordinator led them toward a quiet hallway, away from the tables, the music, and the cameras. But what she said next made both women stop in their tracks. "For the sake of neutrality, we're asking all speakers to remove any political symbols, including the American flag." The noise of the event seemed to fade in an instant. Carrie's brows knit together. "I'm sorry. What?" The woman's tone remained composed, but there was an undeniable tension beneath it. "We want to keep the focus on unity. Some of our guests feel that the flag has become divisive, and we want to avoid controversy." Karoline exhaled, crossing her arms. "The flag isn't political. It represents the country we live in. And tonight, it represents the people we're here to honor." The coordinator hesitated but stood her ground. "I understand, but we need to keep things neutral." A moment of silence stretched between them. The request wasn't just unexpected. It felt wrong. This wasn't a campaign rally. It wasn't a protest. This was an event for veterans, people who had risked everything for the flag they were now being asked to hide. But Karoline and Carrie weren't the type to back down easily. Something in the air had shifted, and this night was about to take an entirely different turn. Carrie Underwood felt a slow heat rising in her chest. She had been in the music industry long enough to deal with corporate politics, PR restrictions, and image control. But this was different. This wasn't about branding. This was about principle. She shifted her weight, her fingers grazing the small flag pin still resting against her gown. The stars and stripes weren't a statement. They weren't a debate. They were a symbol of the very people this event was meant to celebrate. Karoline Leavitt, standing beside her, let out a quiet but sharp breath. She wasn't one for dramatic reactions, but the sheer absurdity of what she had just heard made her tilt her head in disbelief. "Let me get this straight," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "You're telling us to remove the flag at a veterans charity event?" The event coordinator's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked uncomfortable, like she had already anticipated the backlash. "I understand how it sounds," she said quickly, eyes darting between them. "But we have guests who feel strongly about political neutrality, and we want to respect everyone's comfort." Carrie folded her arms, her mind racing. Political neutrality. Since when did the American flag qualify as something political? Her voice was even when she responded, but there was no mistaking the edge behind it. "You do realize some of the people in that room have literally fought for that flag, right?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly didn't want this fight, but she wasn't backing down either. "Carrie, we just don't want to risk offending anyone." Offending anyone. The words sat heavy between them, heavier than they should have. Karoline let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're afraid someone might be offended by the symbol of the country they're standing in? The country that gave them the right to be here in the first place?" The coordinator shifted her weight, but she didn't answer. The silence stretched. Carrie and Karoline exchanged a glance. No words were needed. They already knew where they stood. "We're keeping them on," Carrie said. Simple. Non-negotiable. The woman's posture stiffened. This was turning into exactly the kind of controversy she had hoped to avoid. "Look, I don't want to make this a bigger issue than it has to be." Her voice lowered even further. "But if you refuse to remove them, I can't guarantee how the organizers will respond." Carrie lifted her chin slightly. "Are you saying we'll be taken off the program?" The woman hesitated. "I'm saying I don't know what'll happen if this becomes a problem." Karoline exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. "Then let them figure it out. We're not taking them off." The event coordinator seemed to weigh her options for a few seconds. Finally, she gave a tight nod and walked away, disappearing through the crowd. The moment she was gone, Carrie let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Can you believe this?" Karoline scoffed. "Honestly? Yes, and that's the problem." Carrie pressed a hand to her temple, the frustration simmering beneath her skin. "If we take them off, we send the message that we agree, that the flag is something to be ashamed of." Karoline nodded, her expression unreadable. "And if we keep them on, we risk turning the night into a controversy instead of what it was supposed to be." Carrie was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened, adjusting her gown. "Then I guess it's a risk we'll have to take." A slow smile crept across Karoline's face. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." They could already feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. But they had no idea just how much of an impact their choice was about to make. Back at their table, the hum of conversation and clinking glasses barely registered. Carrie and Karoline sat in silence, both aware of the eyes flickering toward them. The event coordinator had wasted no time. Word was spreading, whispered from one table to the next. Across the room, a few guests exchanged looks. Some leaned in to discuss what they had just heard. Others shot glances toward the two women, their expressions unreadable. Carrie took a slow sip of water, her grip tightening around the glass. This was the kind of moment she had always tried to avoid, being the center of controversy. She wasn't known for making political statements, and she had never wanted her name attached to anything divisive. But this wasn't about politics. Her mind wandered back to her grandfather, the way he used to hold his old service medals with pride. He had told her stories of his time in the Pacific, the friends he had lost, the nights he spent writing letters home, not knowing if he'd ever see his family again. She glanced down at the flag pin on her dress. It felt heavier than it had before. Beside her, Karoline's gaze was steady. She wasn't new to controversy. As a commentator, she had built a career on saying what others were too afraid to. But this wasn't about debate. This was about something far more fundamental. "You still sure about this?" Karoline asked, her voice quiet but firm. Carrie met her gaze. There was no hesitation this time. "I'm not taking it off." Karoline gave a slight nod. Then we stand our ground. As if on cue, a different event official approached their table. He wasn't as subtle as the first. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a forced smile, he leaned in, voice just low enough to keep the conversation private. "Ladies, I need to ask one more time. Will you please remove the pins?" Karoline barely blinked. "No." Carrie straightened in her chair. "Not happening." The man exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated. "This isn't about disrespecting the flag. We just want to keep things neutral." Carrie leveled him with a look. "Neutral?" She gestured subtly toward the massive screens displaying the faces of soldiers watching from overseas. "We're honoring them, and you're telling us the flag is too controversial?" A brief pause. The man's jaw tightened. "Look, you're both professionals. You know how this works. This is a major event with corporate sponsors, press coverage." Karoline cut him off. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before inviting people who actually believe in what this night is supposed to stand for." The man let out a slow, measured breath. "If you wear those pins on stage, you could cost us key donors." Carrie let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's what this is about? Money?" Karoline crossed her arms. "So what happens if we don't take them off?" The man hesitated for half a second too long. Then he gave the only answer he could. "I don't know." The silence that followed was deafening. Carrie exchanged a glance with Karoline. They didn't need to say anything. Then without another word, Carrie stood up. Karoline followed. The official didn't stop them. He simply watched, his expression unreadable as the two women walked toward the stage. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Somewhere behind them, whispers swirled, some approving, some disapproving. But none of that mattered now, because as they reached the stairs leading up to the stage, one thing was certain: there was no turning back. The moment Carrie and Karoline stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere in the Grand Ole Opry House shifted. The soft murmur of conversation died down. The clinking of silverware against plates slowed. All eyes turned toward them. The spotlight cast a warm glow over their faces, but it wasn't just the stage lights making their presence noticeable. It was the way they carried themselves. Shoulders back, eyes forward, unapologetic. Neither of them had to glance down to know that their small but significant flag pins were still fastened where they belonged. The moment had arrived, and there was no backing down now. Carrie took a slow breath, gripping the microphone. She wasn't used to moments like this, not like Karoline was. Karoline had spent years handling heated discussions and standing firm in her beliefs. But this wasn't just Karoline's fight. This was everyone's fight. And tonight, Carrie knew exactly where she stood. She scanned the audience, her gaze stopping on Colonel Robert Henshaw, the 92-year-old veteran sitting in the front row. His hands rested on the top of his cane, his eyes sharp beneath a weathered brow. Even in his old age, he had an air of strength about him, one that demanded respect without asking for it. Carrie adjusted the microphone, her voice steady but firm. "Tonight, we're here to honor the men and women who have sacrificed more than we'll ever know." A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Some of them never made it home. Some of them did, but they left parts of themselves behind on the battlefield. Her voice didn't waver. She refused to let it. "We were asked to remove these pins tonight." A sudden tension swept through the room. A few guests shifted in their seats. Others exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Everyone had heard the rumors. Now it was being spoken out loud. "We were told the flag might make some people uncomfortable." Silence. Carrie didn't look away. She let the weight of her words settle in the air. She lifted her chin slightly. "But let me ask you something. Since when did the American flag become a problem at an event meant to honor the very people who fought for it?" A hushed stillness blanketed the crowd. A few members of the audience stiffened, while others straightened in their seats. It was a statement that demanded an answer, yet none came. Carrie turned her head slightly, passing the microphone to Karoline, who stepped forward without hesitation. Karoline's voice was sharper, more direct. "If this symbol is controversial, then what does that say about us? What does it say about the country we claim to love?" She let the question hang. No one spoke. And then, a chair scraped against the floor. Colonel Robert Henshaw was rising to his feet. It wasn't an easy movement. His body was old, his limbs no longer as strong as they once were. But he stood anyway, gripping his cane for balance. Without a word, he reached up and touched the medal pinned to his chest. Then, with slow and deliberate movements, he gave a firm salute. The weight of that moment crushed the tension in the room. And then, as if something invisible had snapped, a single clap echoed from the back of the hall. Then another, and another, until the entire room was on its feet. The applause wasn't polite. It wasn't the standard reserved appreciation expected at a gala. It was loud. It was unapologetic. It was a statement. Carrie felt something tighten in her throat, but she held it back. Karoline, ever composed, gave a small nod before speaking into the microphone again. "This isn't about politics," she said. "This is about respect." Carrie looked into the crowd and saw something unexpected. A few guests, the same ones who had whispered their disapproval earlier, were now reaching into their pockets, fastening small flag pins onto their lapels. It was a moment neither of them would forget. But not everyone in the room was pleased, and the night was far from over. The applause was still rippling through the room as Carrie and Karoline stepped away from the podium. The weight of the moment was undeniable. They had taken a stand, not in anger, not in defiance, but in principle. And now they were about to face the consequences. As they walked off stage, the event's lead organizer, Michael Garrison, was waiting for them just beyond the curtain. His smile was tight, his posture stiff. A polished man in his mid-50s, Michael had spent decades working in public relations, crafting events with seamless execution and, more importantly, without controversy. Tonight, that had changed. "Ladies," he said smoothly, though his tone carried an edge, "I need to speak with you." Carrie could feel the energy radiating off him. Controlled frustration masked by forced diplomacy. Karoline, however, wasn't in the mood for games. "Is there a problem, Michael?" she asked, arms crossed. Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin before glancing over his shoulder. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "You went off script," he said, "and now we have sponsors threatening to pull out." Carrie blinked. "Sponsors?" Michael nodded sharply. "Big ones. Corporations that don't want their names tied to statements like that." Statements, that's what they were calling it. As if standing by the flag at a veterans event, no less, was some kind of reckless declaration. Karoline let out a humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. We come here to honor veterans, and the thing that's making people uncomfortable isn't war or sacrifice or what these soldiers went through. It's two women wearing flag pins?" Michael's expression didn't change. "You know how this works. It's not about the veterans, it's about optics." Carrie felt a wave of frustration building. "What exactly do you want us to do, Michael?" His gaze flickered toward the press cameras in the distance, reporters already scribbling in their notepads. "A statement," he said. "Something to clarify that you weren't making a political stance." Karoline scoffed. "We weren't. We were making a human stance." Michael pinched the bridge of his nose. He had handled celebrity scandals, PR disasters, and political missteps before. But this? This was something he couldn't control. Carrie and Karoline stood firm, waiting for his next move. Before he could speak, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Miss Underwood, Miss Leavitt." They turned to see Colonel Robert Henshaw approaching, moving slowly with his cane. Even off stage, his presence carried weight. Michael stepped aside, his frustration momentarily masked by forced politeness. The colonel stopped in front of Carrie and Karoline, looking between them. Then, in a voice gravelly with age, but strong with conviction, he said, "I fought for this flag so people wouldn't be afraid to wear it." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Michael shifted uncomfortably, realizing there was nothing left to say. The colonel had just ended the debate before it could even begin, and he wasn't the only one. Beyond the curtain, the audience, once hesitant, once unsure, had made their decision. People were now fastening their own flag pins onto their suits, dresses, and ties. A ripple effect, a movement that hadn't been planned but one that had begun the moment two women refused to back down. Michael sighed, shaking his head. "You just made my job a lot harder." Carrie gave him a small, unapologetic smile. "Or maybe we just made it easier." The colonel let out a small chuckle, tipping his head in approval. And just like that, the conversation was over. But the discussion? It was just beginning. By the time the night wrapped up, the event organizers had a problem on their hands. But it wasn't Carrie or Karoline. The crowd had spoken, loudly. Guests who had initially stayed silent were now standing by the bar, the exits, and their tables, fastening small flag pins onto their lapels. Some had pulled them from their pockets, others had asked around for one. Even a few high-profile guests, people who usually stayed out of anything remotely political, were now wearing the very symbol they were told to hide. The event had ended, but something bigger had begun. Carrie and Karoline could feel the weight of what had happened as they stepped into the back hallways of the venue, walking toward the exit. They weren't naive. They knew this moment wouldn't stay contained within these walls. And they were right. Their phones were already vibrating. Messages, emails, missed calls, people reaching out from all sides. Some were praising them, some were furious, and some, as expected, were trying to clean up the mess. A well-known TV network had already sent a message requesting an interview. A major corporation had quietly pulled their sponsorship. The event's PR team had sent a carefully worded statement to the press, distancing themselves from the incident. But it was too late. This wasn't just about a charity gala anymore. It was about the bigger conversation. Karoline sighed, checking her phone before shoving it back into her purse. "We're about to get dragged for this." Carrie exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Probably." They stopped just outside the entrance of the venue, where the cool Nashville air greeted them. The street was still buzzing with activity, cameras flashing as reporters tried to grab statements from departing guests. Karoline turned to Carrie. "Do you regret it?" Carrie didn't hesitate. "Not for a second." Before Karoline could respond, the heavy doors behind them swung open. Colonel Robert Henshaw stepped outside, moving slowly but with purpose. His cane tapped softly against the pavement. He stopped in front of them, looking between the two women, before giving them a firm nod of approval. "The two of you did something important tonight." Carrie shook her head. "We just did what felt right." The colonel gave her a knowing look. "That's the hardest thing to do these days." For a moment, none of them spoke. The distant sound of Nashville's night traffic hummed in the background, but here, in this small pocket of space, there was nothing but mutual understanding. Finally, the colonel reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled something out. A small, round military challenge coin. He held it out to Carrie. She hesitated before taking it, turning it over in her palm. The engraved emblem gleamed under the soft glow of the streetlights. "That's from my unit," the colonel said. "Only give it to people who've earned it." Carrie swallowed, her throat tightening. Karoline exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You do realize this just made us even more of a target, right?" The colonel chuckled. "Then you're in good company." With that, he tipped his head once more and disappeared into the night. Carrie stared down at the coin in her hand. Karoline watched her for a moment before smirking. "Ready for the fallout?" Carrie closed her fingers around the coin. Then slowly she smiled. Let them talk. Because at the end of the day, they knew the truth. Standing for what's right is always worth the risk, and no amount of backlash would ever change that. If you believe some things should never be compromised, hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.